Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about using some of the models, the diffusion models, contagion models we've been looking at to understand financial contagion, so an application of this. And in particular, what we're going to do is just enrich these models slightly, so instead of having a given node be infected for sure when another node interacts with it and is infected, we'll allow that to have some sort of threshold and depend on the neighborhood of the given node's other connections. So in order to actually have this fit in terms of financial contagions, we'll have to enrich the model a little bit, but we'll be able to simulate it and then see where it goes from there. Okay, so again, this is the application of financial contagions, and what I'm going to do is talk about a simple model I've been working on with Matt Elliott and Ben Golub. And what so a node is going to be some sort of financial organization. It could be a company, a bank, it could even be a country if you wanted to look at the country level. So it's some sort of organization. And it has, first of all, some direct investments. So it's going to have, we'll use 1 minus CI of its direct investments will be owed to their owners or the shareholders of the company. So there's some amount which it has claims to, which it is going to own directly. And then there's some amount, CI, which of the investments which are actually owed to others. Okay, so this could be that it has debt it's issued or equity that are held by other organizations. So this is obligations it has to make payments to other organizations. So it could be debt, it could be equity, it could be some sort of promise to make payments. We're going to keep that very simple in this setting and just treat it as a claim on the investment income that a given organization holds. Okay, so if we get profits from certain products, then some of that goes directly to our private owners, and then some of that can be cross-held by other organizations, either in the form of debts that we owe them or equity payments. And then it also, in addition to the amount that it has directly in its own investments, it also owns shares of other organizations. So it owns some of the claims on the investments of other organizations. So it has claims to those organizations' investments. Okay, so just as an example, we could have, say, let's have the C's be the same. And so we've got, say, organization 1 here, and it owns some of organization 2. So let's say organization 1 has some claim 1 minus C of itself, and then it has claims going out. 2 owns 1 minus C of itself and has claims going out. Let's say 2 owns 3. Let's suppose that 3 has some ownership of 1, and 3 is going to have some amount going out. Now in this case, and let's suppose that 1 owns actually both 2 and 3. So in this case, the fraction C of 3 that goes out towards 1 and 2 will assume that that is split up equally. So there's a C over 2 amount of 3's investment which goes to 2, and an amount C over 2 which goes to 1. Whereas in this case, 1 is the only cross-holder of 2, so there's an amount C which is going to 1, and in this case 3 is the only cross-holder of 1, so there's an amount C which is owned by 3 of 1's assets. So this indicates, for instance, if there was a shock to 3's assets and it dropped, well, it would hurt itself by amount 1 minus C, and it would also hurt 2 and 3 by given amounts. There can be feedbacks in this network. I'm not going to go through the overall feedback effect and figuring out exactly how things transmit, but we can do this directly by just devaluing an asset of one of the companies or firms or organizations, and then seeing subsequently what happens to the other organizations as these values, shocks, transmit through the network. Okay, so this is the basic structure of it. And what we'll do is we'll just do a simulation where we start with 100 organizations. We'll form a random network where the probability that I holds J, so this is going to be a directed network, is the probability that I is holding J is just going to be some expected number of holdings divided by n minus 1. So D is the expected degree. And we're going to refer to this as the level of diversification. So it's how many different organizations is a particular organization holding. Okay, so it's expected to have D holdings of other organizations. It could end up with higher or lower depending on the outcome of the random network structure. In addition to that, then what we can keep track of is how much of an organization is cross-held. That'll be the level of integration. So as C goes up, then more of the income from an investment by a given organization is actually owed to others, and less of it is owed directly to itself. Okay? So the claim that I has on J, the way we'll do this is we'll split it up by the number of, so DJ will be the number of organizations such that GKJ is equal to 1. Okay, so it's the number of organizations that have holdings in J. And so what we'll do is then look at if I get some claim on J proportional to 1 over the number of organizations that hold J. So we're just going to split up equally however much of J is held by others. We'll split it equally among the individuals who hold it. And so C is the amount of J which is held outside, and then I just gets 1 share of that. Okay, so that's just a simple structure for these networks. And obviously, once you're in this world, you could enrich this to have whatever kind of structure you wanted in terms of these cross holdings and so forth. Put in whatever network you want, and then do exactly the same kind of simulation we're doing here. Here, we're going to do it just in a fairly simple form, so we just have a couple of key variables that we're going to vary. And in this way, there's only 2 variables that we're going to vary. One is how many organizations you hold, and the other is the level. And we're keeping everything else symmetric in this structure. Okay. Okay. So 1 asset per organization. It starts at value 1. Pick some organization to fail. So somebody has a bad outcome. Their investments no longer pay off. Their investment drops to 0. So that means that it's going to lose the 1 minus C of its value directly. It's also meaning that the payments that are supposed to be owed to others, the 1 minus C going outward is going to be affected. That's no longer going to go out. And some of that then affects other organizations' values. Those values come back to, it's a feedback in terms of how they impact further organizations, including the original one and so forth. An organization's value, if it drops below theta of its starting value, it fails. So we'll just have some simple rule here that you have to have a certain amount of your initial value in order to stay solvent. If you drop below some level, then you can no longer meet your payments and you have to close up. And then we'll just look at the resulting cascade. Okay? So generally the first organization is often going to fail, depending on what the level of C is, and then that's going to possibly, now it can't make payments to other organizations, they lose the value, and so forth. Okay, so that's the structure. And we can do this in a very simple program now. We construct the random network as described before, shock 1 organization, see whether it's insolvent. If it is, then we're failing it. We look at other organizations, they're losing value, and we go through this. Okay. So now if we do that, and we look at the expected number of cross holdings here. So here is the level D on this axis, going basically from 0 to 20. And here then we look at the percent of the organizations that fail on average in simulations of this. And here what we've done is set C equal to 0.5. So 0.5 of your own investment is owed to others. 0.5 comes back to yourself. And then the threshold in this particular picture is 0.93. So if you lose at least 7% of your value, you're going to drop below the threshold. You have to close up. Okay, so we look at what happens. And the interesting thing about the figure is we see an initial increase. So as we begin increasing degree, initially we see an increase and a peak at about 73%, 72 to 73% of organizations that fail, right in the 3 range of degree 3. So once you're holding about 3 other organizations, we hit a peak. And then as we continue to increase, the number of connections that organizations have, we see a decrease in the contagion level. So by using this, we're varying the diversification, and we see an initial increase and then a decrease. Okay, and if we do this for different levels of diversification, and different threshold levels. So the 0.93, the one we looked at before, had one shape. If we increase that to 0.96, then it means that things are more sensitive. Even a 4% drop causes failures. Then we see higher rates of failure, and the diversification has to become larger before you start seeing decrease. If you run this all the way up to 99%, so organizations, even a tiny amount causes a drop in the organization's value, then once you get to 3 or so, basically all organizations are going to fail and you're just going to have complete contagion. And then if you're down to 87%, so organizations can have a bigger cushion, then you see much smaller contagions, and it happens at a lower threshold in terms of the expected number of cross-holdings or this diversification level. Okay, so in terms of the intuition here, what's going on, when we have very low diversification, basically we end up with a very fragmented network. So there's not many cross-holdings, and if any organization gets hit, say this one gets hit, then at most a few other organizations are hit. If this one hits, nobody else, and so forth. So we end up with fairly contained contagions just because there's not much of a network going on. Once we hit sort of a medium level of diversification, then hitting somebody begins to have wider effects, where now it's got a couple of neighbors, and the couple of neighbors have a lot of their investments in a given organization. And so that hits these other organizations hard, and then we get a transmission, and we can end up affecting a large portion of the network because there's a level of diversification where we end up spreading quite widely, but you're still quite exposed to other organizations. As you get higher diversification, the network begins to coalesce, and eventually, once we've got enough integration, we'll start getting enough diversification, then a given organization might be holding so many other organizations that even if one of them fails, it doesn't affect that organization any longer. So even though the network becomes more connected, eventually, as we keep increasing the degree, the exposure of one organization to another becomes so low that we don't get much contagion. So again, low diversification, fragmented network. Medium diversification, things become connected, so the contagion is possible, and since you're only exposed to a few others, it's easier to spread. Very high levels of diversification, there's little exposure, so failures don't spread, even though they potentially could reach a large number if the shock's large enough. Okay. Integration now, let's change this second component of the exercise. And so what we're going to do is keep the, so for a given level of number of cross-holdings that people have, the given level of diversification, we can begin to increase or decrease the amount of a given organization that's held by others. Okay, so what we looked at originally was the C equals 0.5. We could decrease that to 0.4 or 0.3 or 0.2. And as we decrease that, then there's less and less of an organization which is cross-held. Then that makes it effectively safer in terms of not having as much impact on others in the situation where we fix the threshold, say at 0.93. Interestingly, if we increase once we go past 0.5 and we keep increasing the integration level, when we go up to 0.7, it's actually very similar to 0.5 in this case. If we go to 0.9, it actually drops down again. So why is that happening? Well, now organizations, most of their investments are actually with other organizations, and so the exposure of itself to its own idiosyncratic investments is small enough that you end up not having a first failure. Even if a given organization's assets fail, most of its value is coming from other business, and so it doesn't have a failure even if it loses value in its own. So now the integration is very high in terms of most of the investment value coming from other organizations and not from self. That's another situation. So here, low integration, we have little exposure to others. We don't get much contagion. Middle integration, we have exposure to others that's substantial enough to trigger a contagion. And in high integration, it's difficult to get a first failure going. But if you do get a first failure, then you can get things triggering further failures. So it's difficult to get things started because the first organization is more insulated. Now you could begin to do this, as I said earlier, this was with a very stylized set of simulations. You could do this with actual networks where you've got, in this case, how much of a given country's, so the organizations would be country, and how much of its national sovereign debt is held inside by banks or other organizations inside another country. And so then you could say, okay, if one defaults, there's a certain percentage of that that's owned in claims in another country. That's going to hurt banks in that country. That could lead them to subsequently default if they've dropped below some value. So look at the value, look at the level of defaults, and then you can go through scenarios. Now, generally, these kinds of things are going to be hopefully avoided as governments step in to try and make sure that things don't fail, and the asset, the implications of one asset failure don't trigger others and cascade through the network. But understanding exactly how this does work is going to be important in sort of figuring out how you would want to intervene, what levels of diversification and integration do you need to mitigate contagions, how does that depend on the size of the initial shock and these thresholds and so forth. So we did it in the context of a very simple model, but given that this is going to largely be done by simulation, one can enrich the settings substantially and look at actual networks and begin to play with those and then see what's the ramification. So this would be more specific kinds of contagion models than we've looked at, but ones that are still going to be fairly tractable and ones that can be worked with fairly efficiently by simulation techniques. So, I guess in general, this kind of analysis allows us to do a lot of things. We can put in heterogeneity and so forth. There's a lot that can still be done in terms of future research.